Should we trigger the opening sample?
I think so.
Here's this agile thing with Mike Markey and Matt Beam.
Can fix that in post if we need to. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing all right, Matt. How are you doing this fine, chilly first weekend of fall?
Yeah, it's meteorological autumn now. I don't know if it's chronological autumn, but it's definitely yeah.
It actually is chronological autumn.
Interesting.
We passed what is it, the 21st? We're
Oh
past
yeah,
the mid. We're at that midpoint
equinox.
between longest day, shortest day thing. I think.
Yeah, we just had a day that was equal light and dark. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, that would be a sign, as it were. Could be a
Indeed.
portent. I think we ought to build some religion around this.
Well, maybe somebody's already done some of that. We'll have to do some research, and maybe there's some building somewhere.
It's entirely possible that this is a known phenomenon and we may not be the first to observe it.
I'll put that down for later. So, what are you thinking about this week?
I've been thinking a lot lately about swarming. What about you? What's on your thought process?
I've come across this idea of a design system where it's defined as the specs and the code, reusable modules of code, and that idea makes sense to me. I wonder the expectations downstream for engineering, because the idea is you've got these reusable blocks of code that it will be faster for them to just take these code blocks and insert them into their process. The idea being don't repeat yourself, right? Do it once and then just to repeat it. But there's also some tension between that and the principle of the minimum, much more smaller steps, like this. The idea that you can meander through the code, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually more efficient because you're always using more focused, smaller, valuable steps. I want to explore that. I don't really understand that enough, but I think that's an interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, but I have some experience I could draw upon, and we could possibly build a discussion around this as we maneuver.
That'd be great. I'm not an expert either. We're just talking. Hopefully it's helpful.
Okay. So this is sounding a lot like, where you get a lot of you'll hear architects, you'll hear design leads, you'll hear the people who have the managers of development groups. They're always wanting to do these massive discovery things where they map out the plan or how the architecture is going to be laid out, and then we're going to play in their sandbox as
Right.
development teams. Is
Yeah.
this sort of along those lines?
It does kind of feel like that, the idea of big design up front, or like deciding what we're going to do and making a plan and then just executing on it. I mean, you're right. There is this idea of architectural runway, which is to say we're asking the teams to build this code and these valuable things, but they need to build that on top of underlying systems and capabilities. And so that's still, I'm not saying we throw that out, right? The architectural runway idea is still good.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's really the question of that, can we build these building blocks of code, like actual production code, and then just sort of be able to drop them in during a sprint and have it work out? Are we going to gain as much efficiency from that as we think we are? This is really my question.
Well, okay, so we're talking about reusable modules. We're talking about drag and drop, plug and play, things that we can just put in and save tons of time because we're now reusing a chunk of functionality that happens a lot of times.
Yeah.
And the caveat to that, so obviously that having libraries of things you can build on is a good thing ultimately, right? There's SDIs that we purchase to help us along the lines. There's all sorts of tools out there, but this has to be referring to internal reusable modules.
Yeah, so it would be for a specific sort of context, a specific organization who was going to, let's say they were building some sort of a web presence and they want to have all of the checkbox lists look the same and behave the same, right? All of the elements on the page, or maybe it's for a mobile app, right? The way that the stuff happens in different views in the mobile app is all, but it's for a specific product, let's say, or suite of products. Yeah.
So I could see this argument going two ways. There's is reusability of modules a minimum viable product concern? Right? Because
Yep.
can we get to minimum viable without reusability? And is reusability a nice to have for future development?
I guess it really kind of comes down. What does it buy you, right? I mean, so it buys you consistency, right,
Mm-hmm.
across the board. But I guess when you get down to brass tacks in the sprint, are you gonna be able to just use the thing, or are you gonna end up tweaking it anyway? Really, maybe
Yeah.
there's a trade-off there.
We used to like so to draw back on previous experience, when we would be doing backlog refinement on new functionality that would come in, and we had something where they wanted to make the product owner had this vision that we would be able to private label the functionality we were creating, and because the organization had multiple public faces, like one brand, so one brand, one color and look and feel, another brand, another one, and they wanted to be able to, with the flick of a licensing switch, change identity, right? Which you're talking about style sheets and all this other stuff that you're gonna pull in, and there's a lot of things in place. But we started getting wrapped around the axle of trying to plan the system to achieve that. Right, we're going to plan the system, because we weren't starting from scratch. We weren't saying that every module we create from scratch, greenfield, is going to be switchable. What we're saying is we have a system that is one identity. We now want to morph it into the second identity, and then with the option at some future date of having a third or fourth identity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So now you start a conversation about minimum viable application of that. Is your shortest path to customer feedback, because first of all, we had doubts that the second identity was even useful. So would your first path to customer satisfaction or customer feedback be just to do a quick and dirty duplication of the code with the new identity,
Right.
thereby learning where the differences were between the two? Like, these are all the things we'd have to be able to change.
Yeah.
Right. And then you take your mock-up, as it were, to the user and say, hey, what do you think of this new identity? And if they come back and say, this is stupid, this is a waste of time, then we didn't waste any time writing a generic module that can change identity at a moment's notice.
Fair enough.
But we've also created the second entity, right? So we've got two entities now that would have to be maintained in parallel,
Right.
which would be the inefficiency that people are trying to protect against.
Yes.
The argument that I made in that was, look, the overhead of maintaining the two copies is annoying, and it is a little bit, will add some overhead, but the cost of automating that, it's got to be worth it to you. And I can see when it would definitely be a cost saving measure is when you have to do the third identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we wrote the stories as first blush, duplicate. Second blush was take on the new identity, and then third blush was, okay, now make it possible so it's generic. And it was,
Makes sense.
so I mean, I get that there's that second tier, or that second location where you're maintaining two copies. It's bad. This is along the lines of the same thing you're talking about. We're talking about generic modules that we don't want to keep reinventing the wheel. We don't want to use copy paste as a design model, right? It makes for very ugly code, and it tends to. I actually knew an engineer who we used to walk up, like he would go, I could do that in 5 minutes, and he would do it by lifting a chunk of code from one place and duplicating it, and then just tweaking a little of the business logic, but he never changed variable names or anything, so it still looked like its old thing in its new form. And it was a common statement to say copy paste is not a design methodology. And he goes, but it is effective. Like, well, kinda. But then we look at your check-in patterns, and it's check-in, check-out, check-in, check-out, check-in, check-out as you compile, run, find out it doesn't work, and then tweak
Yes.
it.
Yeah, you're still end up using engineering time. I just noticed a parallel or a correspondence. So I used to be a technical writer
Mm-hmm.
many moons ago, and it was on this big Java application. And when I got there, we were basically writing the help documentation inside this, and it would end up being inside the app. So we would write words that would end up as HTML inside a Java application code. We would also write PDFs for every new release. There were hundreds of PDFs that had to be maintained.
Yeah.
And when I got there, part of the release process for the new version of the software was to literally go into each Word document, change the version number and the date, resave it as a PDF. Pause for
Wow.
effect. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that sounds
was
like that sounds like something that could use a. Oh, wait.
a design system. I was
Yeah, there you go.
So what we did, we ended up using this. The idea was take there's this concept called DITA, Darwin Information Typing Architecture, and in this sort of approach, every content there's only three types of content. I think there is reference, there's content, and there's process. So anything you're going to do is either here's a content. Let me explain to you the concept behind this part of the product, right? It's a reference. So this term means this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or there's a process. There's a numbered list that takes you through something you need to do. And all the information is one of those three.
Okay.
And so in the Darwin information typing architecture, it's all XML files. And so the real power of it is you take your content and you abstract it away into just plain text XML files. So you write your stuff once, right?
Mm-hmm.
You update the process once or the reference. At runtime, then what you do is you set up different targets. And so what we did is we said, here is an HTML output that then the Java engineers can create some process to pull it into the Java code for the app.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different target for PDF, right? So you change the date variable once and you regenerate hundreds of PDFs in, 15 minutes as opposed to a week, right? So there's a huge, and it was awesome. It was clearly the thing to do, right? So that, but I will note that the process of understanding how to take the output of that, right, for the HTML files, and hooking it up to all so this one little HTML output, right, has to go into this subdirectory in some Java method or something. That part, hooking that up, super complex. Lots
Mm-hmm.
of upfront work. Once you got it dialed in, man, obviously much better. But it's not, I guess maybe the concern I have is like the idea that we're going to standardize this and it's going to be just straight open dry highway from now on. It's like you might just
It's
be
like
moving your stuff.
You're trying to get into a perfect library reference system in one pass. Like,
Yeah, the sort of the translation or the hard work of figuring out how this actually is going to get hooked together, that's problem still exists. You just kind of pushing it around, right? If you can get that part nailed down, then the system can be super slick in operation. But just
okay.
understand that there's that work to do.
So you had mentioned this this code reuse thing, and they were looking at the dry principle.
Don't repeat yourself. Yeah.
Don't repeat yourself. Wait, I'm sorry. What was that again? Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you very much.
You're welcome. We'll be here all week.
Tip
Literally, we work here.
Try the
Yes.
fish. Yeah.
The fish not this week, but go ahead.
All right. So the dry. Don't repeat yourself. I would posit for a moment that the dry principle could be argued to be anti-agile.
Mm-hmm.
Because
supposition.
We're not trying to be responsive. Like, for instance, to put something out there, because even if you suspect it will be reusable, the overhead associated with reusability has a cost. And if you just go through anticipating that anything you do may or may not be reusable, you could be, and even if you've got a vision that this could be a reusable module we'll use many, many times, If the stories in which you use it again and again and again are much later in the backlog, then the cost you spend today is slowing down your reaching your MVP potentially.
Potentially. Yeah.
And there are always exceptions there. I mean, this isn't a generic thing. Like if you knew, yeah, in sprint 1 we're going to work on this system and this is a piece that we think could be reusable, and in the second sprint you say, and that's where we're going to reuse it, I would think that at the time that you need it the second time would be your first opportunity to make it more generically reusable, right?
It's the first time that you know it would be valuable, or you would have evidence of it being valuable, because it's the
Yeah.
first reuse and the first efficiency you'd have. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're not gonna be guaranteed that you're going to do it. So if there is a big overhead in maintaining that reusability, then the cost of it becomes the cost versus value proposition. What do we call those things?
Total cost of ownership?
Something like that. So those notions become the tips it over. It's now worthwhile to do because we know we're going to get a benefit from doing of it.
That's what I'm getting at. It's the trade-off of, if you do some upfront work, it'll make you faster downstream. Okay. I just want to understand how we make that connection in any particular situation, because sometimes it's not so easy to know.
And the thing that I always took issue with is we'll point our grubby fingers in architecture's direction, because architecture loves that. The architecture always wants to design the system in the perfect way.
Right.
And I've had projects that sat on the launch pad for months while the architects thought really, really hard about things and wouldn't let anyone move forward because what if you'd go off the rail that we are building? And I think if you go back to your many much more smaller steps
What is
model.
it? Many more much smaller steps. This comes from GPA Hill.
Okay, so GPA comes in and says, hey, so you ask the question, what happens if you go off the rails? And we've been facing this question in the agile space for ages. How far off the rails can you get in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to 6 months or a year. Right. And if you're working in smaller iterations, if you're doing extreme programming or something, you're getting a week off the rails. It's not very far.
So it's a way to manage risk. It's to cap the downside, the potential downside, because you can't get very far before you yeah.
And so I could see, like, I'd be doing estimation sessions with a team, and they would the developers would go, well, see, it depends. And we were like, okay, how big is this? Well, it depends. Am I making this reusable, or am I making this a one shot? And it's like, is there a major difference there? And like, well, yeah, if we make it reusable, then it has to go into this storage place and this library, and now it incurs this other testing defect and all this cross trains. And it's like, oh, okay, so what is it if you just do it quick and dirty? And they're like, a point. And what is it if you do it this other way? It's like 3 points. Like, okay.
But in those extra 2 points in the difference, they don't get logged into some technical defect sort of debt accounting system, or do they?
How do you mean?
Well, so you're saying if we do it quick and dirty, right?
Yeah.
That's 1 point. If we do it in a way that it's we clean up the technical things that might bite us later, it's 3 points. The difference there, right? You could think of that as technical debt or something to pay off later.
You could. I think this is more architectural debt, because we're not talking about something that it's something that might come back and bite us. So you could say that when we do the second story, in which it turns out we need to do the same thing, you could say, well, we already have that, but we got to modify, and that would take a point. Or we could spend 2 points, and now it's reusable.
Right. So I guess maybe it's a question of what's the value. Is the value in just getting it now and you don't need anything else, or is the value delivering it and creating this system that allows you more speed in the future if you do it right?
Yeah, I enjoy the meandering architecture idea myself. I've never been able to make a plan that lasted long enough to survive to the end of the plan. It always
Yeah.
modifies itself.
Yeah.
And that could just be a shortcoming on my part. So I don't want to go dissing everybody out there who can make deterministic plans for long periods of time. But there's probably a reason why I gravitate toward agile, short iterations of ways of working, because I prefer to be responsive to the needs as they arise. And if I
Yeah.
do, because I can, when we're designing stuff around the house, when I'm working on the displays for the holidays and stuff, I will noticeably get locked up if I try and make something super generic. Like I'll sit there and it's like, oh, well, I got to go put this thing together. I got to build a prop for the display. Like, cool. It would be really cool. I mean, I know this year our ideas, we've got figures that we put LEDs in the eyes and they glow a certain color. And this year, for some reason, we decided to make a plan where color of the eyes means something. And so the fact that we were buying characters with certain color eyes in the past, or whatever color eyes was available, now I'm going back in and I'm swapping them out so that they can all be the new color.
You
Right, that
discovered
were
technical debt in
yes.
your display architect. Yeah.
And also in the process of doing so, I discovered that there are LEDs that are color changing, that you through the application of a few tweaks, you can make them change to whatever color you need. So I'm
Yes.
sitting here going, I have built quick and dirty props over the years and there's some with yellow eyes and some with red eyes and some with orange eyes or whatever color I had available. Right. I got one guy out there that's got blue eyes because that's the color the skeleton came with.
Yep.
And I now say, well, I want this unified theme. We're doing a bunch of green eyes. Am I going to go swapping out green LEDs? And next year we're going to dream up another theme. And now I'm going to go around, I'm going to replace all the eyes again. What if I now use this more generic technology that's more expensive to use and more difficult to use, because it's not just flick a switch and it's done. It's a programmatic thing, which means now the figures with these changeable eyes have a coding module associated with it, and now they have to be wired into the system, and all this other stuff has to happen. You got to be able to send out a signal that says, everybody green eyes today. And there's even some figures that are going to change color, like I've got an application to use the color changing, therefore I've got a blueprint in which I could make everything color changing. But is it worth it to do that?
What's the cost of constantly refactoring your quick and dirty versus building a system that speeds you up? What a great non-technical example of that. Yeah, I love that. That's very clear. Yeah. So what did you decide to do?
Right now I stare at this little module next to me that's doing color changing on the LEDs. And I think, gosh, it sure would be nice if I started doing, see the throbbing that's going on.
I do.
Yeah, that's there's some, and then it's going to go out, and then so this is the notion. Here's the animation that comes in from the thing you've got. Oh, hey, I'm a red-eyed guy, and then this thing happens, and I suddenly change over to green, and that's the
So you're doing a spike. You're kind of refining your backlog.
Yeah, and then and seeing what the cost associated with doing that is, and going, is that worth it? And then so now I'm going, I can't go sticking I could go sticking an Arduino module in every single figure.
Yeah.
Just to do color changing on the eyes, which seems really costly and stupid, right?
Gold plating, right?
Or do I figure out how far a signal to an LED will go, and can I run the color changing from a central point, right? And
so
then
you're having an architectural discussion with yourself.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. While I'm trying to build a bunch of stuff, and so this is a good amalgam for the thing that are happening in these systems. That
you're building out an architectural runway so that when you get to the point of having to build the thing, which is the figures, you've got what you need there to build upon, is what I hear you saying.
Except I don't have time to wait to build the architectural runway. If I were to build the architectural runway first, Halloween would come and go, and we would not have anybody outside with any of these features, right?
So the business owner comes in and is like, here's the point of doing all this.
Yeah.
If you don't make this, none of it matters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do what you can in the time frame possible. And then if it all, so at the very least, I'm looking at these new figures I'm building and saying, okay, MVP up on a certain date and running with the color eyes I need. I'm making it so the eyes can be removed easily. Like I've the architectural conceit I'm giving myself is instead of just soldering the eyes in, I'm putting them into a socket and plugging the socket into the head, and then I can swap out the LED if I need to. And then pass 2 is now give it the ability to read a signal and drive a multicolor LED and swap that in. And then pass 3 is this figure has enough going on that it's worthwhile to have the computer module in it, and therefore I can shift it to autonomous color changing instead of running off a central thing. But I'm not getting that all in place first, because then I will never have anything outside, because I will be making the perfect modular system that wouldn't it be great if I could do this, trumped getting anything done.
Right. You have an ocular architectural backlog that stretches out several years in front of you, and it gives you the ability to deliver the value you need. Hit the dates. Yeah.
So I can do the quicker thing. So I think that's the many more much smaller model.
Yeah.
Right. Do what you can, do what you need to do what you can do, and then do what you could do.
And I think one of the key aspects of this, the Chief I would say, is the key to the many more much smaller steps is that you might end up touching the same thing more than once, and that's not a flaw. That's actually that's the part that you sort of give up having to. You're not just going to do things one time. You might have to touch it a couple times. That's fine as long as you get the value you need, right? And actually, also take care of the architecture. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the drive principle there. I mean, I remember when I was writing code, because you wrote documentation, I wrote code, and I remember a few times I would write something and then mayhem would occur and it would go away, like I would lose it.
Somebody would take it out of the code base?
Oh, let's say it got overwritten, or a computer turned off at an inopportune moment before a document was saved, or something.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's now lost. I went through all the trouble to create it, and now it's gone, but I still need it. So I have to create it again.
Yes.
I hated that.
That's true.
Hated it. Because I was repeating myself and I wasn't gaining anything new in the repeating myself. But I had another friend who was also a developer, and he had a theory that he was never happy with any code until he had written it the third time. So he would write it once, get it out there, and then he would throw it away, and then he would write it again, and he would make it better, more efficient, more cool. And then his third pass was when it achieved this nascent state in which he would go, this is now God code. I can do anything with this. And to him, that repetition was a natural progression. And I could see value in that. You're doing an improvement. So popping the eyes in once. Yeah. Okay. Table stakes. Got to have that.
Yeah.
Being able to go back and change the eyes, that's a nice to have, but that would be really nice to have the second time I have to do it. Being able to just program the eyes so I don't have to go back in. That's the God state for it.
Couple of thoughts, because I've heard this, there's I don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but the second time you wrote that stuff, you probably did it faster, right? Because you'd already thought about it.
Yeah, it definitely went faster. And that was, but I'll be working with teams and we're saying, well, you're going to work in smaller things. And they say, well, you're asking us to make decisions before we have an architectural runway or any of this other stuff put into place. I'm like, well, do you need the architectural runway? And they said, yes, because that will define the limits of what we can do. And I'm like, well, it can also define the constraints. Like you will lose a little of the autonomy and a little bit of the potential for dreaming up new things.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes that's the coolest part is when you come to the point where you go, hey, I need to, We need to, hey, wait a minute. What if I did it this way?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, because what you're talking about in the the first version, second version, third version of the eyes, that this person you described who wrote the code 3 times, that sounds a lot like refactoring to me. Making
Mhm.
sure that it does the same thing, you get the same outcome, but it's easier to maintain, easier for a human to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, just makes the whole process of doing this, creating this value, easier, less effort, which means now you have more room to do more stuff. So it
Yeah.
increases your productivity.
And the notion is the second time around it goes a little bit faster and it gets a little bit better. So it's an improvement. Now it's an invisible improvement most of the time, right? So that's where it's more refactoring than
Interesting.
although
Invisible.
although it could be driven by a customer need red eyes this year, customer need green eyes next year, customer need screw it, we want them to change to whatever color we need.
Right.
Right now the customer is red eyes green eyes. My implementation was whatever I've got eyes, easily changed eyes, changeable eyes, right?
So in that
My
sense, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
I was just say it's not invisible in that sense, because if you were looking at the whole thing, you would see more output or outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're getting more efficient. So I see what you're saying, but it's also, it has an effect, a visible effect on the system.
Yeah. So the product owner's going, look, you threw this thing together last year. I got the red eyes I wanted. It was 1 point. Then I said, now I want green eyes. And you said, that's going to be 2 points. I'm like, what the heck is that? What's going on there? Why is that costing me 2 points? Last year, it cost me 1 point. And it's like, well, because you have revealed to us that you are going to want to change these things. That's causing us to do an interim step toward a dream that if you ever come at us with the third change, we're going for the dream.
Next year it will be 0 points, and
Yeah.
it won't just be a change from this color to the other color. It'll be a color from this color to any color.
Yes. As a matter of fact, with the addition of this other reusable module, it could change dynamically throughout an animation process or throughout a thing. So yeah, I can see. So I don't, where are we right now? The dry principle. I know that I've got developers who hate to repeat themselves and they don't like revisiting code, but I don't know if that's because of an inherent dislike in doing that, like I expressed, or is it because they have been conditioned not to want to do that, or that's bad.
Yeah, and have those discussions been in the context of total value or total cost of ownership or total trade-offs, right? Because you can see there's value in it in some cases, but it really depends. Well, what are you ultimately going to be asked to do and asked to deliver? And there's some automation that's helpful for that, but like putting a test in every single thing, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's too much. You always have to think about. You always have to be willing to come back to the whole central question of value and what does that trade off look like for us at this time in this context.
Yeah. So
Cool. I feel like we sort of drained that concept
a little bit,
topic.
a
Yeah.
little bit. Although it did bring up an interesting segue
Mm.
because that notion of reusability and how that it affects the team has come up in the past as a stranger in the room, say an architect who appears in the midst of the team and says something along the lines of, why the heck are you doing it that way
Mm.
when you could be making it generic? And the whole team just stops and goes,
What's the value in the
yeah,
generic?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so we've had I had mentioned I'd like to talk about swarming. And swarming has been on my mind of late. I've actually done a couple of presentations in the recent past about the concept of swarming, because when we train people, we always talk about, you're going to be put together in a cross-functional team. You're going to operate in a completely interactive, always moving toward completion. We want you guys to figure out new ways of interacting and try and get stuff done simultaneously. And that is not the way people think about that process. They think through conditioning that it is a sequential process, that you design something, you write something, you review that thing, you modify it based on those reviews, you throw it over the wall to a tester who now that he's got this working thing, will create tests to exercise that thing, and then review those tests, execute those tests, send the feedback back over the wall, right? So it's all we ended up doing in a lot of these allegedly cross-functional teams was create shorter waterfalls, right?
Yeah, the thought that strikes me is what you're talking about is so if you think about all the things that have to happen,
Mm-hmm.
there's some design talk, there's some implementation coding talk, there's some testing, how we're going to do that talk, and when you spread it out like that, you're having a small number or just one person who's got that skill, but they're making assumptions about the other parts, right? And they might not be making the best assumption or the best decision because that other person who could give input to design. So if you got a designer, right, they're assuming what the tech, where the code writing they're making assumptions about that. But if they had the tester there to talk
Mm-hmm.
about it while they were still making the design, uh, they could arrive at the optimal decision like immediately, as opposed to setting that and then watching it play out and having that feedback loop be
Mm-hmm.
hours or days or weeks, as opposed to, oh, let's do it all right now. Yeah, the concept of mob or ensemble programming, it does inherent
Well,
implicitly, it feels like it's less efficient, but also it's not, the value is not in the do, like the type, it's not typing, it's understanding and making decisions about how the whole, because ultimately you're not going to ship just code, you're not going to ship just testing, you're going to ship the whole thing as it fits together at the end. And
right.
so understanding how that happens quickly as possible, maybe that's the key to like making it clear why that's more effective, to have more efficient, to have everybody doing it all at the same time, because that's how it's going to be. That's where you're trying to end up.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that you use the term mob or ensemble program. Ensemble one I haven't heard before, so that's one I've got to add to my repertoire.
I think it means the same thing. We just don't want to use the term mob because it's,
Mob has a negative
mob as a
connotation.
negative context.
Well, so I wasn't even talking about mob programming when we were talking about swarming. So we had said that teams should swarm around stories
Hmm.
to protect against outsized whips, like getting the work in process too much. Because, as we've talked about before, whip limits apply to individuals. You can only focus on so many complex things at a time before your performance in any of them or all of them degrades because of task switching. So for many people, that is one thing. Some people can pull off two because there's natural gaps and they leverage those. But
Yeah.
for the most part, you try and keep that. Well, the same as individuals have a whip limit, teams have a whip limit. There's a number of things, a finite number of things that they can divide their collective attention against
Yeah.
without losing efficiency due to collisions or wait states or things where a member of the team who you need to do the next step on story 3 is already engaged on story 1 or story 2 and isn't available. Therefore, you're waiting for them to become free. So, and then when they become free, they come to do this, which means that is languishing now. And so your cycle times stretch out. And,
Yeah.
and so you can do cycle time analysis. You can take your team's execution strategy when things were in an in progress state, whether that was being coded, being reviewed, being tested, any of that stuff, until it hits a done state, whatever you've decided your definition of done is. That cycle time, if you map those out across many sprints, you'd want to see they fit within sprints and they're not passing, they're not exceeding a sprint boundary, and you're not getting a lot of carryover.
Yeah.
But what you also hope to see, at least this is my theory, and please stop me if I'm nuts,
Just a couple guys talking.
that in general a cycle time for a small story should be shorter than the cycle time for a larger story.
This seems intuitive to me.
I would say in general. I mean,
Yeah.
there's obviously sometimes you'll get a story in which you give it a high story point because there's a complexity associated with it, but that complexity just means you need to think really hard, not take a lot of time, right? There is no correlation between size and time, as we keep saying all the time. So you won't see a perfect thing there. But
Yeah.
you don't want to go looking at the historical performance of your team and see the 1-point stories taking 75% of your sprint and the 5-point stories taking 75% of your sprint and the 2-point stories taking 75% of your sprint. It's like I would look at teams, and every story would open up in the first day or two, and every story would close in the waning moments of the sprint. They
Yeah.
all had the same cycle time. It was all 2 weeks long.
Yeah.
Right. So swarming was offered as a way of enabling shorter cycle times by reducing the focus of the team to 1 or 2 things at a time, right? Focus a lot of as much attention as possible on the first highest priority story you have.
Effectively lowering whip.
Right. Effectively lowering team whip, because we're
Right.
only focusing on 1 or 2 feature stories, whatever your unit of progress is based on. But within those, lower whip of the people involved so that they're only focusing on one aspect of that delivery. So I will enable this by saying, let's do more detailed subtasking. Let's take this story and let's break it down into, based on our definition of done, based on the skill sets of the members of the team where natural handoffs would happen, based on intra role divisions, like, hey, this is a piece of code that's very long and complex. Yes, one developer could do it the whole time, or we could chop it in half and one developer could do one part and the other developer could do the other part at the same time. So you go through and you make a rather detailed list, and I don't recommend doing this forever and all time for every single story, but when you're trying to learn this concept, it's pretty helpful. So the team sits down, break it down to everything you can think of that's necessary for this story to reach definition of done, and just collect them, right? In the old days, they would have been subtasks. They would have been cards on, Post-it notes on a board underneath this common story. In Jira, there's subtasks underneath a common story. But then on your first day of the sprint, when you're going to work on that story, you come in, and instead of the 3 questions that everybody gets used to asking that gets things really stale and provides absolutely no clarity into where the stories are, unless only one person is ever working on one story, then you get some idea. Right. But if there's ever a point at which I'm really rambling now, if you're ever at a point where the story changes hands, like a developer codes the ticket, then they throw it over the wall to somebody to review the ticket, and the ticket changes ownership, right? Yep. Yep. There are tools out there that encourage this workflow, right?
There sure are.
Jira and things like it that only allow one owner to an issue and provide these helpful Kanban-esque boards in which something goes from a to-do to an in progress to an in testing, in review, whatever state train you've built, all the way to done, but only one person owns it in each one of those buckets. And it subtly encourages linear delivery of the story.
100%.
Yeah. Right? Okay, so I break that by saying you're going to go to a simpler Scrum board. You got to do, in progress, and done. The detail of where the story is based on the subtasks that are in progress, not based on the state of the story. Although if you want to maintain the state of the story, that's fine. I don't care. So on day 1, what's the most important thing that we have to do to reach our sprint goal? Well, it would be this story here. Okay, team, how many of those subtasks that we've called out could go in motion today? How many of them did? And the first, well, I could write the code. It's like, really? Is that all you could do today? Is that the only thing that could happen today? Could anyone else do one of those subtasks
It's the
And
most important thing, right?
right.
Yeah.
I mean, what else are you going to do? This is the most important thing. This is the highest priority. So usually what I hope to see is, if there's a front end and a back end, a component to a story, that one of the developers will take the front end, one developer will take the back end, a tester will come in and say, I could start writing test cases. And somebody usually whirs on them and says, wait a minute, how can you start writing tests for something that doesn't exist yet? And then you say, really? But
we know what it's supposed to do.
we know what it's supposed to do. We've talked about this. We did backlog refinement. We just had a planning session in which we talked about everything that needs to happen to deliver this story. We know the end point of this thing.
We have a set of acceptance criteria that are simple assertions that can be just translated into automated tests.
Exactly. So you'll get a team that says, all right, story 1 is now in progress, and these 3-4 subtasks are in progress, and that has consumed the attention of 3 to 4 members of this team. Does everyone have something to do now? No. Oh, is there anything else we could do on this story? No. All right. What's the second most important thing we could do? Go to the next story. Divide stuff out again. Who could do? When everybody's got something to do, you stop. You have completed your plan for the day. Everyone's got something to do. You've limited the amount of whip the team is focusing on. You've limited the whip of the individuals that are working on the stuff, right? They will come back to the well when they can to get more subtasks. Tomorrow we'll repeat this process. We're not going person by person saying, what did you do? What are you going to do next? What do you do? It's in the service of delivering the stories, in the service of delivering our value or our goal. What are we going to do today? And so keep the focus there.
Yeah, I love that. I'm thinking about using it sometime in the future with the appropriate team. The only thing missing from that is, how does the Scrum Master get the status and translate that into red, green, blue? Not sure how I understand.
What? Oh man, really? You had to go there? So why? What? Let's pretend that was a serious question.
Yeah.
What do you need, Scrum Master, to be able to report the status of this story?
I mean, I just need to know if it's going to, is it on track? What percentage done is it? Like, when will it be done? Somebody's going to ask me, and I need to be able to tell them with certainty.
Well, the one thing that you can say with certainty is that it's going to be done as quickly as possible, because we're checking the individual steps every single day, right? We're moving stuff. We're subtly pushing them toward the front. And I really like taking a Kanban board approach, starting with the done column and saying, is there anything that's there in progress that could come over to here? Like, could we pull anything to done? And then now the stuff that's to do, can we pull any of this into in progress?
Yeah.
Right. And working with, and the team can always see what the steps left to deliver that story. They can feel like they're making progress, even though that Jira burn down chart based on stories is stagnating for long periods of time. And these are a certain brand of story, right? These are these stories for cross-functional teams that are very siloed, and they don't have, front-end developers back. They've got distinctions in role, as opposed to what someday the dream would be. These are cross-functional individuals who have developed comb shape skills. They're full stack developers. They could do testing. They can do the whole ball of wax. And everybody's a developer. Even the testers have learned to write code. Anybody could take any part of any story. That's the dream. I've only ever had one member of one team who could actually do that once. But
yeah, that's an unusual, and so that's a great call out or caveat for people. Like what you're describing is a pattern of facilitation for a team at a certain level of process maturity or understand, or whatever you want to call it, right? When you get teams that have really, really deeply understood and practiced this stuff, like they develop their own. That's where the self-organization really kind of it turns into its own thing, right? And so there's less facilitation you need to do from a Scrum Master point of view, or whoever, process person.
Yeah. So I had to map out the execution of a sprint, and then I had to genericize it and project it so anyone could make sense out of it. So I ended up building this mythology, a story basically it went along this line. So we've got a team that is going to take on a series of stories and deliver them within this sprint. And if we use the swarming technique on stories to limit the number of stories that are active at any given time, as soon as the subset of your team is committed, you're done talking about that. So let's make our team small enough that there is only the one subset, right? So now they go
it's a
through.
single-threaded team.
It's a single-threaded team, but they're executing in multi-threads because they're running multiple subtasks off the same story as much as possible.
Okay.
And they are going to try and get a story to done before they open up the next story.
Right.
Okay. So everyone's like, yeah, that looks great in theory. We could see how we could share the responsibility. Yes, we're going to and everything is done. Boom. Perfect. Yeah, we get it. Let's try that. That works fine. But what happens if, and then this is when the strangers in the room come out of the woodwork and start asking questions. Why is that track of that individual, why is there that big gap in activity, right? Why is that person like they're idle, right? Idle's bad. Could they just start another story?
Boy, there's not a good answer for this at the process level or the engineering level. My guess is that the reason that question comes up is because there's an assumption that we want full utilization of people. Full utilization works for machines, right? Where they're not thinking or being creative or exercising any judgment and engaging with any subtlety or nuance that is inherent in knowledge work amongst people, right? Your washing machine should be running 100% of the time. Your knowledge worker is not like that at all. And actually, if you want the most output from the system as a whole, right, which is where you should be measuring, people need to go to the bathroom. People will be daydreaming. And that actually it's an assumption. It's a managerial assumption, right? You can't, I don't think, I haven't found a good answer at the level of process or engineering. It's like the way that we think about people is that they're there when we need them, right? They're available to think about like a relay race, right? The person who isn't going to run until the third, handoff is just standing there. That's not a flaw.
Yeah,
that's how the system
it's
is.
like,
That's how the system.
Should they be tossing shot puts or something while they're waiting?
Shouldn't they be doing calisthenics? They should be doing something.
Like maybe pole vault or something. I mean, I got time to get a pole vault in while you're running your lap of our relay race, don't I? I
make her do push-ups until her thing gets there because she's got to be doing something the whole time. No, right. That's actually a flawed assumption, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one though. I haven't used that one before. That's cool.
I don't remember where I heard that, but I do think that's such a great because
I use I'll use the highway utilization. We've talked about the 100% utilized highway as a parking lot.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the app server is another good one. 100% utilized server. Try to get something out of that.
It's like, hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Excuse me. Hello.
Oh. Let's find a place with some room to move around because that's how we do our work.
Yeah. Now, and I mean, you could take it back another step and say, look, I was focused on delivery of this one subtask and now it's done and I'm going to take a breath before I take on the next one. And maybe in that breathing space, now that the pressure's off of working, I will think of something else, think of a better solution, think of how this applies to the future thing. It's kind of like that thing where I have a friend who says his best ideas come in the shower.
I was just thinking that. Yeah, yes, exactly.
Right. So it's hey, I'm not doing this right now, and then the innovation happens. Right. That's when you go, oh, hey, wait a second. So gaps in the system or gaps in flow are not a flaw. I think they're part of the method. I think they're part of the design.
I would restate that slightly to say gaps in an individual's utilization activity are not a flaw. You want to have no gaps in the flow of the work as it goes through.
Correct. Okay. Great. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. You're no downtime. If you do value stream analysis, it places you find, okay, this bit of thing went into the system here and it came out here, and in between, you look at all the times that people were working on it, and it's like, I don't know, 20% of the time we're actually working on it. Mostly it's waiting, right? This is the
Yeah.
sort of the idea. It's what makes these big systems really inefficient. Is that, like, we're not focusing on having somebody available all the time to pick it up when it's ready for them, because they have to be busy all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's where your trade-off comes in, and it's not a good trade-off.
Right. So then the inevitable happens where one role has an outsized task, something that's much bigger than all the other tasks. Let's say something that we've changed triggers a regression cycle. So suddenly the testers have to do a bunch of back testing, right?
Yeah.
And that story is now going to stay open until they finish the regression, get the feedback back to the developers. Developers can respond to that, blah, blah, blah. Story can be closed out. Now there's this big gap of idle time from the developer's perspective, that while they're waiting for that to happen. Okay. This is one of the what if scenarios that was thrown as an objection to swarming.
Can the developers use that idle time to automate the regression tests so that
Wouldn't that be nice?
just an idea.
So so I argue, and I've had people come back and they'll say, well, we have people for that. We have regression testers. It's like, cool. Are they working on this part? Like, no, they're doing other parts. So you don't have anyone doing this part. So you're right. And this is my argument. My argument is that the team, now that they are working together and committed to delivering any of this piece of value, any member of the team technically should be able to take on any task. And if there is a large regression cycle that needs to happen, maybe the better answer is to divide and conquer and have everybody help out. And instead of taking, for instance, a 4-day regression cycle and reduce it by 4 people helping to 1 day. And that is probably one of the only places that you can get away with the baby scenario, the 9-month baby scenario.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, if the important thing is to get this thing to done, and the most important, the bottleneck on that thing getting to done is this task, well, then you probably want to increase the amount of capacity on that task.
And then everyone's like, but I don't want the developers' time to be wasted on testing, which is a whole nother cultural statement, right?
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with testers. There's nothing less about being a tester or testing, but it is different. It is a different type of work that developers generally aren't the type of people who like to do it, right? It's repetitive. And by that, it's boring to them, and they hate that, right? They hate repeating things. So my argument is that the notion of automated testing was created by a programmer who was forced to run tests, right? They looked at this and said, I could make this easier. I could make it so I don't need to do this repetitive thing. I can write a program that'll do that repetitive thing. And then the testers go, really? Could I make it do that? And then boom, innovation happened, a change occurred. So when you get a situation though, where an outsider comes in and says, hey, look at this chart. These developers are idle because you won't let them start another story.
Yeah. I would look at the instrument in the chart and say, are you sure you're measuring what you think you're measuring? Are you sure that you're, yeah.
So they looked at that and the statement was made. This could be a waste of valuable people's time. And I came back and said, well, maybe what you should do is make them go through that. Because I will guarantee you, if you put a programmer on a test plan, he's going to figure out a better way to run that test. And if you take that option away from him by making him start the next story, which I was able to demonstrate through my remarkable animation skills, how this creates a snowball effect in which the testers fall behind and never catch up again. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so then the cycle times start growing. And it was like, hey, just as soon as someone can do something, just fill in the blank. And I was playing Tetris on a project plan with subtasks, right?
Yeah.
And I said, even assuming the simplest case in which all stories are the same size and all the subtasks are the same duration, and we lay these out on a timeline, thing just becomes unmanageable after a while. And then you have to start saying, if they're switching context from one story to another, you have to increase the time of that to account for task switching, context, brain mush, right?
Yep.
So then this stuff grows, and then it just started snowballing, and it got to the point where, gosh, they were never finishing stories in a sprint. They always had carryover, and I did that in only 2 sprints of simulation. If I had gone to the 3rd sprint, it just would have been random subtask of Palooza, which I think is where a lot of these teams that we find are. They come in, they said they make us do these cross-functional teams to work in this so-called agile way, and this doesn't seem any better than anything we've been doing. In fact, it seems like chaos. Like, well, yes, the way you're
Yeah.
doing it is chaos.
This is what it means to me ultimately to organize around value, right? As opposed to organizing around functional groups or a schedule.
Busyness.
Busyness.
Organization that's more interested in keeping people busy than in delivering value.
Burning calories as opposed to getting anywhere that's worth going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, swarming, I view as a way, and so you had brought up mob programming, and that is not necessarily what we're talking about here, because we aren't saying every member of the team 100% focused on one machine doing one task, right?
Yeah.
Although that is a way you could do swarming. It's
For
more
sure.
like all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians are Catholics, right?
Totally.
It's so all mobs are swarming, but not all swarming is mobs.
Yeah. Ultimately, I feel like the ground truth, or like the inescapable reality, is that my brain can focus on one thing at a time, really.
Mhm.
If I try to do 2 things, both of them get fuzzy. And it's even true. I mean, the CPU in your computer actually is in the same boat. It only does one thing at a time. Now, it can look like it's doing 2 things at a time by switching really quick.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what we do. But we're not nearly as good at it.
and even then, there is a measurable gap between the one task and the other task, as stacks are pushed and stacks are popped and the next context is reloaded and then the execution happens. There is a time at which that computer is doing nothing of value.
Yeah, there's an overhead in the. I'm not a designer here, but there's an overhead in terms of the kernel and the scheduling in the kernel, and that stuff has to happen perfectly, because if it doesn't, you get a kernel panic and everything goes black. I think we've probably taken this analogy as far as we can.
I think so. Anyway, so
That's good.
I've had a fun conversation. I hope our listeners are having a fun experience listening to our crazy ramblings.
And if not, I mean, we're constantly improving, so just give us a little time.
Yeah.
Should we end it?
I think we shall. I think this is a good place.
That's the end of this Agile thing.
Farewell, everybody.
Have a great week.